How much do you know about the Constitution of the United States? Hi, everybody. I'm Mark David Smith, and we're going to talk about the Constitution and the history of the Constitution today, which is something that, quite honestly, I didn't know a whole lot about, and probably still don't know, but a small little fraction about. But I've been looking into because it's something I think I and all of us Americans need to know as much about as possible. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. I'm by myself today so far. Somebody pops in and wants to jaw with me a little bit on this, they're welcome to come in. So we're going to talk about that a little bit right after this.
I like to teach the world to sing. Sing with me.
Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. We're so glad you could attend. Come inside, come inside.
The Constitution of the United States of America. Now, did you know that many other countries also have their own constitution? It's interesting that the United States came up with theirs, and we have the longest running constitution in history. So I really don't know the statistics or how many countries had one before the United States, but many have developed their own since the United States developed theirs. And so let's take a look at the history and see what we think, because as I read through the history, I found that there was a few things I knew, but most of the things I didn't know. And I love history. I really do. I retained some of what I learned in school, but very little. Life comes into play, and you lose a lot of those things if you don't think about it all the time. And then somebody brings it up, and it's like, yeah, I think, but I'm not real sure. So the Constitution of the United States is our standard here in this country, and by standard I mean it's what our lifestyle as an American, as a patriot, should be, and how we live in this country and how we treat each other in this country. And the Constitution helps to set forth those boundaries, so to say. And believe it or not, even if you're a rebel, you have boundaries. And so the Constitution, to me, kind of sets forth those boundaries for each other, whether you're religious or non-religious, whether you're black or white, or of course, we know the United States is probably the most diverse ethnical country on this planet. We've opened our doors to so many different people and so many different kinds of people and backgrounds from people that we're wide open. Now, before we get started with the history, I also want to I take a bit of a controversial stand, and it's based on what I know. And of course, everything that we do, and when we take a stand politically or ethically or whatever, of course, it's based on what we know and what we have learned in our lives. I'm 65 years old. I've been through a lot of things. I've owned the Lamb Network now for over 8 years, and I've been in ministry for 40 some years, and it's afforded me to meet a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds, religious backgrounds, ethnical backgrounds, a lot of different cultures. And so I enjoy this. I love learning about people's backgrounds, who they are, their culture, what's they're about, what they believe spiritually. Interesting word to use, which is the most common word when using it in that type of sentence. But and so I've based on what I do know, I mean, it's for instance, like talking about the standard by which a person lives. In Hebrew, it's called halakha, and the halakha by which a Jewish person lives is the Torah. The halakha, or the standard, or the way of life that a Christian lives, is mostly the New Testament, as they believe that Old Testament's been done away with, and Jewish people believe that the New Testament never came to be as something to look to live by. And so you have your standards, you have your halakha, the way a person lives. And of course, the Bible in itself is, I live a Messianic lifestyle. The Messianic standard is an incorporation of both Torah, the prophets, the writings, the Brit Hadashah, the Tanakh in itself. All of those things should influence us on our halakha, on our way to live. And so we take those things that we look into and we set as our standards, and it defines us. It's who we are. And the Constitution of the United States, set up by the early fathers of our country, was their standard, but they were also lawyers, and they some of them had been through government in the old country that they came from, and so they had a very mature way of looking at life and how they had lived it before. Some of the standards were the Bible as it was in their time. And so a lot of things within the Constitution are set up based on that. We can see a lot of the laws in our country do follow that standard. Whether or not they follow Torah law is a whole nother story, but we do. My wife and I are constantly running across different laws, and our eyebrows pop up and say, wow, that's a Torah standard, that's a halakha. And so it's interesting to me. I love learning about this. I love seeing the history of these things and learning what has come forth, how we're living it out today. Life has changed today. We all know. I mean, like say, I'm 65. I've seen when I was a boy. I still remember some things about being a boy and how this country lived, and the standards that it lived by, and what would make a person appalled by things that would happen. What would, when I was a boy, I can still remember that if something happened in the news, that people would be like just very surprised that this happened, or could not believe that the country would allow something like this to happen. And of course, we should all know that when one thing happens in life, in lifestyle, in a country or a group of people or a culture of people, and that certain thing which didn't really go along with the lifestyle that this culture had lived before. And America has its own culture. The things in our life that have gone before makes up our culture. And these things that when we accept a change like that, then it builds layers upon layers upon layers. And then that culture and our standards, our halakha, changes. I mean, for the most part, most people would call it progress. The way that a person looks at certain laws, or laws in the Bible, or the constitutional laws of whatever country you live in, the constitutional laws of a culture. Whenever you accept a certain thing indifferent than what you had done before, then it changes and makes the next thing that you wouldn't accept before is of lesser value, and now makes it easier to accept things that you wouldn't accept before. And so I've seen this in my 65 years. I've seen most of what I remember are like TV shows I grew up with, like Leave It to Beaver, and those type, or Dennis the Menace. And you can even watch those shows today and see the culture that they lived in, and see things that happen on these shows will literally show you a normal American lifestyle that was lived back in those days. These are things that were accepted or not accepted based on the culture and the constitutional lifestyle that people live in a country. And of course, the United States produced a lot of television shows and movies back in then. I can still remember that one of the most controversial things that happened in history, and I still remember this, even though this happened when I was really young, was the movie Gone with the Wind, where the character Clark Gable played, I believe it was Rhett Butler, used the word damn, D-A-M-N, in the movie. And it just caused such enormous uproar, I don't know around the world, but in the United States, that a movie would allow this one word, to be used the way it was used in the movie. And of course, we know that since then, this movie, this word that was mentioned in there, the standard based in what TV shows and movies, not so much TV shows, it's TV shows is it lagged a little bit in what it would allow to come into TV shows, but in movies they were just it very quickly changed what not only was allowed for language, but what was allowed to be on the screen as far as immoral acts, immoral based on the standard that most people knew in the United States, and the ethical understanding that people had changed as and even what would be allowed in public. A lot of things that were in the movies, if it was accepted by people in a movie, then in lifestyle or what people talked about in public would change. And being 65 years old, I have seen a massive amount of changes since I was a boy and the things that I understood. But when you're living through this lifetime, through this era of where you're at, like right now, these are the things that you know now. We don't know what's going to happen in the future, so we don't even think about how bad can it get, because we think that whatever it is right now, for the most part, now today we've seen so many different changes that we do know, most of us know, if you're mature, you know that things are going to change, and things are the ethical and moral standards of the country we live in and the world are constantly changing, and not necessarily for the best as far as we're concerned in our moral and ethical standards. But once again, thinking back to the time when I was a boy, when I was a teenager growing up in school, and then leaving and going to college, and then in the workforce as I was in my 20s, I can think back and think of how people perceived and either accepted or rejected certain standards that were now publicly known. What is private, of course, and if any of you know me well, know that I have such a huge issue with things that are private becoming publicly known. So these things I'm talking about, our lifestyle and the standards by which we live, and why and what this country goes by. These are things that have changed just in the past 60 years, that have gone such a huge drastic change. And even though, of course, my main topic today is the Constitution, which was set forth 245, 250 years, generally, about 250 years ago, is, with the exception of the Articles of Change, that have been implemented into the Constitution, and it does have to progress, but still the basic standards of this Constitution of the United States, set forth by its authors, and for the reason that these authors set it forth, is still a vital issue today. Vital. 250 years later, it's still a vital issue today. And we still look to this. It's still talked about. It's still brought up in politics. It's still brought up in the public eye every single day in this country, and even people around the world refer to the Constitution of the United States around the world today. And so this is interesting to me, that a document such as the Constitution of the United States, developed 200 and almost 50. It's been 240 years, give or take. How long it's been is still a vital issue. Whereas our moral and ethical understandings, the way this country perceives life and standards, and allows things to be done, said, and performed in public is amazing to me. Just absolutely amazing how the progression and progression is not always a positive thing. You can have a negative progression of things. People think that the word negative means that it goes back. Well, it's not true. We have progressed in many different ways in our culture and in this country, in our halakha, the way we walk, the halakha of our life in this country, and the way we live, whether or not it's a religious understanding and lifestyle that we live, or a secular lifestyle understanding we live, it is still that halakha. It's a way that we live. So that real brief introduction there. I mean, could be lengthy for you, but let me give you just what I found, just a real brief outline of the history of the Constitution. And I apologize if you're not interested in this, but to me, to understand what especially a document is talking about, to me, it's very important that you understand the background to it. Where did it come from? And the Constitution of the United States was not just somebody sat down and wrote this out and said, "Hey, this is good. What do you guys think? Hey, you want to do this? We've got a country going on here." And no, it doesn't work like that. It never works like that. So once again, let me give you I've got an outline kind of written up, and so let me present this to you and see what you think, and we'll go from there. Now, we're all familiar with the Revolutionary War. When the people were people in Britain were very tired of the government being run by the religious system, which was Catholicism of the land, and the two worked together. We all familiar with the Queen, which has has so much authority and over the country, working with the prime minister. It's so interesting that this religious system was also the governmental system of Britain, and the people rose against that. They could not change that system. That system is still in effect today, 250 years later. It is still in effect today. And the people of the time decided they didn't want to have anything to do with that anymore. They wanted to set up their own government. And there were so many people that agreed with this that they left Britain, came over to a land that had already been found, and understood that this was something, that the place that they could go. They loaded up ships and they came over, and within I'm not going to go through all that time, but within a short period of time, Britain wanted, to regulate these people. And for a time that they did, but that was a governmental system that still needed to be formed within these new colonies that were being set up, because people continued to leave Britain. They loaded up ships and kept bringing people over to this new country, and colonies were set up. Well, they finally set up boundaries around 13 different areas and called them the 13 original American colonies. The United States, they put it together as these are different states, they're different colonies, and when Britain kept coming over to the government kept coming over and wanting to set up their own government here, which the people left because of that. They rose up and said, "Fine, we're not going to do this. We're going to come against you, and we're going to stop you from continually coming over here." And thus, we had the Revolutionary War. Now that lasted between 1775 and 1783, and it was against the Britain influenced political ideas and revolutions that were put out by Britain throughout the globe. Now, if you'll remember, Britain at one time had gone through most of the countries on the European side, including Israel and all the Islamic countries and everything, and had caused the pogroms against, had worked with Russia and were trying to be the ruling factor of all the different countries around the world. And there are incredible stories about how Britain just tried to, of course, there's been many different rulers throughout history that have gone through the world trying to be in control of all the different countries. And so the 13 colonies here in the United States that left Britain because they didn't want to be under that religious governmental rule, decided to rise up against them. And of course, we know that they won their freedom. They defeated Britain to the point where Britain seceded, and they went back to Britain and decided not to fight them right now. We'll come back later and try this again. And we've known several times they've tried to come over in the early days. So what happened the war was between 1775 and 1783. The 13 colonies realized that if they were going to defeat Britain, they needed to get their own government set up and not be under the British rule anymore, because that was a constant fight. And yes, we've got to have government set up. We are a new country. We're not going to be tied to Britain. If we don't get a government set up here, then we're going to be constantly relying on Britain to set us up. So in 1777, which is only a couple of years after the Revolutionary War started, it was put together by these 13 original colonies to set up what was called the Articles of Confederation. And the purpose was to plan the structure of the new government and to create a confederation. Now, when I hear that word Confederate or Confederation, I think of the Civil War, where the North was fighting against the Confederate Army, and the Confederates were all in the southern parts of the United States. And that's what I think of. These are rebels. Well, the word confederation actually means an organization which consists of a number of parties or groups united in an alliance or league. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they're rebels. They're just aligned together. So what you had in the 13 original colonies was a confederation, or a group of people united in an alliance or league to make up their own confederation and not be forced to follow by another group. The first written Constitution of the United States. So, did you know that the United States has actually had two different constitutions? And I didn't until I started studying this out and finding these things. Of course, this just makes me want to go in farther and farther and farther and find this out, because this is very interesting to me. I always thought we just had one constitution put together by a bunch of guys, and this is what we live by, still by today. Well, it's not true. Let's see, first written Constitution of the United States, written in 1777 and stemming from wartime urgency. The urgency was, again, I just said, is that because Britain helped to set up their government there, they didn't want Britain to be in charge of their government, so they wanted to set up their own. So it was an urgency to get this done so that Britain could see, well, they've got their own government. We can't rule that anymore. Of course, then it was slowed by fears of central authority and excessive land claims by states. So what was happening is that since there were 13 original colonies, 13 original states here, that each one of them, some of them were small, some of them were big, and they were saying, well, we're big, we've got more land, we've got more people living in our land, so we should be in charge. We should be the ones that set forth the standards, and the little ones can have their say, but not as much. Well, it's like, no. I mean, if I'm Rhode Island or Massachusetts fighting against Virginia or West Virginia, which are huge states, I'm not going to go with this. I want equal ability to have my own say into this. So they constantly fought, but I mean, this is normal. And of course, then it was ratified, which means to sign or make into effect, bring into effect, on March 1st, 1781, which is, they finally got it together. Under these articles, the states remain sovereign and independent. That is the difference between the original Articles of Confederation, which was considered a constitution, and the Constitution of the United States of 1787. And so what it means is that each state still remained sovereign and independent, but yet they were united in the fact that they didn't want to be under British rule, and they needed a centralized government. At this time, in 1781, they named the new nation the United States of America. And so Congress, they put together a Congress, and you got to remember that the British rule was still there during this time, and remained. They had people from the government in Britain, in these United States government, in the government, in the Congress that they had set up, even still at this time. And so the Congress there at that time was given the authority to maintain armed forces and coin money. They were now coming up with their own money. They lacked the ability to levy taxes and regulate commerce issues that led to the Constitutional Convention of 1787. So the 13 colonies, the 13 original states, were now understanding that the states have their own sovereignty and they are independent, but we realized that if we're truly going to fight off the British, that we have all got to come together as one united group of people. Even though we can have our independent laws, we're going to have to come up with a constitution, a written document that everybody's going to agree on. And then we can stand united, and we can stand as an armed force against Britain. And this all happened while the Revolutionary War was going on. So they did agree to this in 1787. Remember, the war didn't end until 1783. So in 1787, while they were still fighting the British, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, along with several other leaders from each state, got together and in the Congress and decided to we're going to hold a convention and bring together the leaders of all the 13 colonies, and we're going to put together something that's going to unite us. So individually, George Washington was called the Sword of the American Revolution, unanimously elected chairman of the convention. We have Benjamin Franklin, and he added the experience of an elder statesman. He was a lot older than most of them, but had been through so many different things as far as British government was concerned, and government. Was considered a religious man and very knowledgeable. His intellect of that time went beyond most of the other people, the other men of that era. Then there's James Madison. His contributions were so notable that he was dubbed the father of the Constitution. Now, that's a whole huge story. I could do an hour and 15-minute show on just James Madison because of all the things he contributed, along with like Alexander Hamilton and many, many other people that got together and they spent hours and hours and days putting together and writing out what was right. I can just imagine they're writing these things out. Of course, they don't have computers like we do today, and putting all this together so that they could have it all right there and agree on one document that would be accepted by all 13 states and all of the representatives of the 13 states. Together, these men sought to preserve and strengthen the young republic, forestall anarchy. So in other words, they constantly had to battle, even though they were their armed forces were fighting against the British government. And remember, once again, this is the British government that was going through the entire world and conquering other governments and causing other governments to be just annihilated and taking over. I mean, their army was huge. And yet these little 13 colonies were fighting against this worldwide British government army system. And so there were constantly people in the states and the representatives of the states that were fearful of this and said, how can we fight them off? We don't want religious government rule, but we want our own country, but how can we fight this off? So you had all the anarchy that was going on and people that were weak in what they were doing right there in the government. Together, these men also wanted to ensure security of life and property against dangerous uprisings, create a political structure that would endure, not just one. See, that was the problem with the Articles of Confederation. It was a document that brought all the 13 colonies together, but still allowed them to be independent and do whatever they wanted to do and not be under one rule. So that's what they were working so heavily on, trying to put that together. They wanted to create and design a firm, dignified, strong, and respected government, not only that was recognized and respected by the 13 colonies, but remember, these people had taken over a new land. They were pretty massive. And remember, people were still flooding into this country from Britain, and it was building and building and building. The United States was constantly expanding and expanding. These people realized that they were creating an entirely new country within the globe. And they wanted to, if they're going to put this together, if they're going to be this, they're going to have to have a governmental system and a united system between these 13 original colonies, and especially if they were going to expand. They knew that the land here in Northern America was huge, and they could even expand the country even farther than the 13 original colonies. They wanted to be recognized by the countries abroad. They wanted to be recognized by the world as a country within themselves that had defeated the British armies, and we stand alone as our own United States of, actually, from what I understand, it was of North Americas, because they were familiar with the globe. They knew there was a North America and South America. They were the United States of North America. And of course, that was too much. So I'm not real sure, but for some reason it was made smaller into the United States of America. Sorry. Hold on. Appreciate this. Appreciate your staying with me on this. This is so interesting to me. I hope it's interesting to you. For 17 weeks, these men discussed plans as Virginia's large state plan. Now, this is something that I had never heard of before, but I thought was real interesting, is that in putting this together, once again, even from the beginning, there were very small colonies like Rhode Island. Massachusetts was not very big. New Jersey was not very big, but there were huge states like North Carolina and Virginia, and there was just massive states there with a lot of people, and then there were little states with not very many. And so they had to have a balance that they didn't have before. And if they were going to be able to make up this constitution, each state, no matter how big they were, how much land they were divided into, they wanted equal understanding, that we get to have equal input into this constitution, into the articles that are going to be written up, into the government system. If we're going to be a United States, we are going to need to be on equal standing. So as they discussed their plans over 17 weeks, putting this together, and they had representatives from every state in here working on this constitutional document, they had what was let's see. Here, let me look here. It came down to large states and small state plans. So what you had, two different states, two different colonies that helped to put together a balanced plan. So Virginia's large state plan proposed that they abolish the Articles of Confederation and create a new form of government under which representation in both houses of it's called a bicameral, two house. That's interesting. I've known of two house for a long time, but I never heard it called a word like bicameral. So so they wanted under which representative in both houses of a bicameral two house Congress be essentially based on population, an arrangement that would naturally give more representative to larger states. New Jersey I guess you can now. I don't know why all of a sudden I went, my mic went off. Can somebody in the chat tell me if they can hear me or not? Yep, yep, yep. Hello, hello, hello. I hope you can. I don't know why it went mute, but it did. So, all right. So, nobody's typing in there. Okay, very good. Thank you. Has it been off for a while? I hope not. Well, may have to edit this. I don't know. Okay, so after prolonged debates, the delegates arrived at the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise, which formed a new national government with three branches, which is, okay, good, thanks. So they performed what they called the Connecticut Compromise, because Connecticut is a kind of a medium-sized state. You got New Jersey and Rhode Island, which are real tiny, and Virginia, which is huge. And so Connecticut comes in and let's do a compromise, and we're going to call it the Connecticut Compromise, which formed a new national government with three branches. Instead of having each state just come in and say this or do this, they decided that what they needed to do was divide it up into three governmental branches, which is the executive, the legislative, and judicial, as a checks and balances system, which is still the way our government works today, which is based from the Constitution, which means that they you had the executive system that is also subject to understanding what the legislative system is saying, and the judicial system is not over the executive and legislation, but equal to and a meshing of, so that you have the checks and balances. So let's take a look real quick here. I'm gonna wind this up. The legislative branch, based, once again, this is not just a history of the United States. This is a history of the Constitution. This is what they put together almost 250 years ago as a structure so that we would have a culture and a way of life, a halakha based on ethical and moral standards that would help to balance out our what was happening in the United States. And by having this structure once again in place, it now allowed them to say to Britain, look, we have our own governmental system. We don't need your religious uh, government, your religious and government, to rule over us. We have our own system. And so let's look at the legislative branch controlled all the courts and jurisdiction except the Supreme Court, which would be bicameral. Bicameral in the legislative branch means that you have Congress, which is bicameral. It's a two-party system. It's the House of Representatives and the Senate. Now, the House of Representatives, a state's representation is based on its population. For example, smaller states like Vermont and Delaware have one representative, while larger states like California have 53 representatives. The members of the House of Representatives would be elected directly by the people of the states and would serve 2-year terms. And the Senate, which is put together by each state, regardless of population size, would have 2 senators. The members of the Senate would be elected by the state legislators and would serve 6-year terms. So this is where you're seeing this bicameral system, in that the House of Representatives is made up by the state's population. And if they're large, they get a large amount of people. If they're small, they only get a small amount of people. Whereas the Senate is made up by, regardless of your population size, would have 2 senators. So that's the bicameral system that they're talking about here. Now, the executive branch, which is in itself, by itself, the president and vice president, period. The president had a term of 4 years. He could be reelected. He is the commander in chief of the military. He has wide powers of appointment to domestic offices, the Supreme Court judges, and granted the power to veto legislative bills. Then you have the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court, which incorporates in appellate and original jurisdiction. So these 3 systems put together to balance everything out even helps today. And we know that we're constantly having problems with our government, but yet, can you imagine if we didn't have these checks and balances, if we didn't have these 3 systems, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branch, if we didn't have these 3 systems, forget chaos. This is beyond, it would be beyond chaos. So we can say all we want to about how it works, but it works. Our system does work. Before the Constitution could take effect, it had to be ratified, which means sign or give formal consent to, and making it officially valid. Of the 55 Constitutional Convention delegates, 42 remained to ratify the document. Only 3 of these 42 refused to sign the Constitution. So we have 55 people from the 13 original colonies put together to vote on what the Constitution is going to be. When the Constitution was presented to the 13 individual states, the Founding Fathers claimed that the Constitution was not an amendment to the Articles of Confederation. Remember, the Articles of Confederation is the Constitution that's in effect already. While they're doing this, they already have a Constitution in effect, but it was so radical, it was so diverse, and it allowed each state to make up their own rules and regulations, and they could do whatever they want whenever they want. And it wasn't really a united colony state. They said it's not an amendment to the Articles of Confederation. It needs to be established as a completely new form of government. They declared that it required approval by 2/3 or 9 of the states, 9 out of 13. Therefore, the states held ratification conventions. At this point, each state decided, once they had the Constitution put together by James Madison and several other of the representatives of the different states, they had put the Constitution together and presented it to Congress. And now each different state put together their own convention where they were to choose voters in each state, present it to the people of the state, and approve the new Constitution, which is interesting to me because I never realized that the Constitution was actually presented to all the people in all 13 colonies, and they were allowed to get together and go over word by word by word by word of the Constitution and decide whether or not all the people of the 13 colonies wanted to have this or not. I think that's pretty cool. That's something I just guess I just never understood, but it's very interesting to me. So they got together as state conventions and put this together. And so the new government would receive its power from the people rather than from the states. And see, this is what your acts of confederation was that if they didn't have this Constitution document, the document that came with the Acts of Confederation just allowed each state to come in and do this. Whereas with this new system, it gave the power to the people rather than the individual states. I love it. I think it's great. Several states were alarmed that a Bill of Rights was not created, but were assured that the first Congress would add such a safeguard by amendment. So as I've read over, and I've read the Constitution, I have this wonderful little book here, and you can get this book too. If you just look it up online, look up the Constitution of the United States, and let me give you a real quick since I'm talking about it here. Let's see, the National Center for Constitutional Studies. So if you will look up the National Center for Constitutional Studies, this is an amazing little book. It has all kinds of quotes by the different authors of the Constitution, by George Washington, Daniel Webster, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson. It's got quotes by them about the Constitution. This is an amazing little book, and it has the entire Constitution and articles in this book that you can read. Makes it very easy for reading. You can actually read it online. If you're interested in all that, look it up. There's all kinds of sites on the history of the Constitution and that type of thing. But the Bill of Rights. So they knew what a Bill of Rights was. It individualized the people and there was, as we know in our culture, there are many different cultures, and they knew that even at the beginning. So it's like, okay, this Constitution is a document setting forth the standards, the Holocaust, so to say, as I was saying earlier, the Holocaust, a white person walks in a particular culture, and this is a culture of the 13 colonies, the original United States and so they knew that this set forth the standard of the governmental system and how it was all going to work and how it worked for the people, by the people. And yet it didn't relate to rights based on the culture of the different people. And so they knew that they had to have a Bill of Rights and amendments to the Constitution as time progressed that would help them to set forth different standards as the country progressed. Yet still they needed a base document that they could rely on to be a standard and to be a foundation to work from. But it had to stay a stable document, and that's what the Constitution was about. So in July of 1789, the people of the United States ratified. They signed it. They assured themselves and the people that this was what they needed. They ratified the Constitution and instituted it as supreme law of the land. Today, the United States Constitution is the oldest written constitution that has continuously remained in effect in the world. It also established the first federal form of government, as well as the first system of checks and balances to prevent any one branch of government from acquiring too much power. Now, once again, all of this is based on the fact that they needed to put something together to separate themselves, to consecrate, to set them apart from the British government, which was a religious governmental system. And so even though the Catholic Church in Britain, the Queen had power on the government, the government still existed as an entity of its own, but yet they had to mesh together into one system, and then they couldn't. There's many things they couldn't do without the Queen's permission, and the Queen couldn't do without the government's permission. So they knew this was wrong, and they knew that they had to separate themselves. And most of the people were very religious, and they knew God's halakha. They knew their own biblical halakha, the way that they walked. They had a good moral and ethical standard that they already lived by. Yet they knew that their government had to be separate from that. They needed to be able to stand alone by themselves and not let another government come in, and especially with a religious system, and take over the government. So that's how they stood alone. And when they did, and when they all came together to do it, they won their independence from Britain. And so amazing. It's just amazing. I love to know what it takes to come together and what they did. And it took a war to do it. It took a system of people that knew how to do this type of thing, because they had already been a part of the British government. And it's an amazing document, and this is just, I've already done a couple of shows where we talked about some of the quotes from different people, the intro to this book, this type of thing. But I wanted to put together history. So the next time I come back and do a show on the Constitution, we are going to start from: we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish the Constitution for the United States of America. Now, this is the words, the preamble going into the actual Constitution of the United States. Interesting to me, this is a word I've talked about many times in the years I've been teaching, is that word blessings. The word blessings is a religious word. How many people do you know outside of living for God use that word blessings? Just in day-to-day life, stop and think of how many people are there people in your life that are outside the kingdom of God that use that word blessings? No, stop and think about it. It's extremely rare that word is ever used. There are words we use on a daily basis, like blessings, faith. Faith is a generic word that sometimes people use outside the kingdom of God, but mostly it's by us in the kingdom, like the word blessings. And so the fact that the word blessings us and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. In other words, those that come after us, the country that comes after us, and the people that come after us. And so it's like, to use the word blessings to me is a general way of saying, God, thank you for the liberty that you give us in all that we do, and thank you for the liberty of our government, that we don't have to be controlled by a religious system. That's what I read into that, and that's what I get out of it. Sticking with it. So, Father, I love you, adore you. I thank you, Father, that we do have liberty. We do have freedom. We have freedom in you. We thank you, Father, for the halakha of your Torah. We thank you for the laws, the teachings, the instructions, the understanding that we get from your Torah. I thank you, Father, that you have instilled that into our hearts, our souls, our spirit, Father, that we serve you, a mighty, true God of Israel, and that we have boundaries that we can live by within our understanding of you and our worship and praise of you and the lifestyle that we live. Thank you for those boundaries. Thank you for those laws. Thank you for Torah, Father. And I thank you that I live in the United States of America. I thank you, Father, that we had godly men and women that put together this basic law of proclamation that helps us to know our boundaries within a system and within a government, within a country that still lets us have the freedom to live the way we want to live. And I thank you for it, Father. I give you all the glory, the honor, and the praise. B'Shem Yeshua. Thank you all. As always, I have no idea what will be on next week's show. And I hope you were blessed by this. I love it. I so love being able to see and know these things and the history of these things. So I don't know when we'll have another show about the Constitution. It might be next week. I don't know. But thank you all for joining me. And by the way, on the Lamb Network, we do have the Lamb Network website. There is a video series of the Constitution. Let me take you over there real quick. Let's see. Messianic Lamb Radio. Don't you forget, don't you miss those things? Messianic Lamb Radio. All right, let me take a look here. We're going to take a look at the website. This is the way it looks right now. We've got a video series on the coronavirus. So if you want to find different things, Torah portion series, all that kind of stuff. So on the Constitution, if you'll go to more video series and then scroll down to the Constitution, you'll see that there is a video series on this. We've got two so far, one with Sherry and one with John Craig. And so I will be adding this show into this video series, but that's how you get to it. So be sure and go to the website, check it out. And there's so many things on there. You can watch the shows straight from there. Segments of shows are on there. So thank y'all for sticking around. I hope you were encouraged by this. I hope it helped you understand a little bit more about the Constitution and our way of life, our halakha, the way we walk. And so once again, thank y'all for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Gotta go. Susan's here.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hoogie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.